Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the Rambling Kings podcast. This month I'll be rambling about King Stephen of England and how the civil war he started inspired the House of the Dragon / the Dance of the Dragon. And as a special bonus, I'll be looking at some of the characters from the show and trying to place their historical counterparts. In our last episode we looked at 3 great kings, but first, who was King Stephen? Long-time subscribers will be familiar with him, as I created a series about the Anarchy about 3 years ago. King Stephen was one of the many grandchildren of King William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, and Stephen is often referred to as the last Norman king, despite not really being a Norman, yet his mother was the daughter of William the Conqueror, and Stephen's father is also called Stephen, who was the Count of Blois. Now, before we continue, I must admit I have a bit of a bias against King Stephen, as during my time researching the civil war he started, named the Anarchy, I felt that my opinions on him were negative, as I believed, and still do, that Empress Matilda, the only legitimate child left of King Henry I, was the rightful ruler. Now let me just go over quickly how the Anarchy started. So Henry I, son of William the Conqueror, took the throne of England after his older brother, William II, died from an arrow wound in the New Forest. Because Henry had another elder brother, Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy, Henry's claim to the throne of England wasn't solid given he had an elder brother, but as Henry's father, William the Conqueror, took England by the right of conquest, elder hierarchy didn't matter if Henry was powerful enough to hold the throne, which, after a conclusive battle against his elder brother, who he later imprisoned for the rest of his life, Henry controlled not only England, but Normandy, and to strengthen his position further, he married well. Now I'm summarising this all as there's a bit more nuance to it, but Henry married Matilda of Scotland. Just a quick FYI, Matilda was a very popular name at this point in history, so quite a few Matildas will pop up. Now, what makes Matilda of Scotland special is the fact that she had the blood of the House of Wessex. The last king of England that belonged to the House of Wessex was Edward the Confessor. So, by marrying someone who belonged to that dynasty, he was giving himself, and more importantly, his heirs more legitimacy. A slightly small tangent, Henry was a massive slag who fathered a lot of children, at least 29 that are recorded. However, the major problem was Henry's legitimate male heir, and a lot of the royal court died in the White Ship disaster, where most of the people and crew aboard the ship got incredibly drunk and crashed into some rocks. The ship sank rapidly, and nearly everyone bar a butcher drowned. There's even a poem about the disaster. Those for whom Duke's weeps were devoured by sea monsters, he whom a king begot became food for the fishes. How quaint. Stephen himself was due to be on the ship, but due to an illness stayed aboard a less rowdy ship. History really can change by a whisker sometimes. King Henry's dynastic plans were now literally at the bottom of the sea, and the tale goes that everyone was scared shitless of telling Henry, until the men pushed a young boy to tell the king. The news broke the king's spirit. Henry tried to sire another heir by marrying Adeliza of Louvain, yet they never conceived. So Henry's new tactic was to promote his daughter, the Empress Matilda, and making his barons swear over and over and over and over and over again to make Empress Matilda the ruler when Henry passed. The reason she is called Empress is because she was originally married to Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, yet that marriage also produced no children. Henry V later died of cancer, so Empress Matilda was then married to Duke Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Matilda was less than happy about the match. Anyway, back to King Stephen. He spent his childhood days within Henry's court, so Stephen wasn't some outsider who simply nicked the throne. He was a powerful noble who was actually quite close to King Henry, and therein lies another issue that would cause the anarchy. Henry had made powerful men within his family, not least Stephen, but also Robert, Earl of Gloucester, one of the king's many bastards. So there was a lot of issues that culminated into the Civil War. The sinking of the White Ship, the lack of desire for Empress Matilda to become ruler, potentially alongside her husband, and the already powerful nobles who did have the power to claim the throne, which is exactly what Stephen did. Now that I've summarised King Stephen and the Anarchy, I'll now go over the regular structure of the podcast. So what I think of King Stephen, what I think the public perception of King Stephen is, the culture around King Stephen, so video games, TV shows, etc. And finally, looking at the sources of information about King Stephen and comparing the historical characters with their fictional counterparts from the TV show House of the Dragon. Let's get started. So, what do I think of King Stephen? Well, it's difficult because his entire reign is pretty much summarised by the events of the Anarchy. Although, obviously, the first 4 years of his reign, there was barely any conflict. It was only after Empress Matilda arrived with her brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, that the Anarchy really kicked off. But I suppose the way I rate all my kings is based on what they did for the people. Now, obviously, with medieval monarchy in England, at this point in time, the king is anointed with sacred oils and makes a load of oaths to protect the people and look after them, the king's peace, etc., etc. Stephen, in some regards, you could argue, failed epically in that because of the Anarchy. I'll just quickly break off and say that the Anarchy, despite its title, it wasn't as destructive as the title implies. If you were a resident of the West Country and the Midlands, you probably might agree with that, because during the Anarchy, Worcester, obviously my home city, was sacked. There's an account by John of Worcester who mentions the city being sacked. There's also Nottingham at the early start of the war being sacked. Oxford obviously was besieged a lot because of the Siege of Anarchy, which is the most romanticised bit where Empress Matilda escapes from Oxford Castle. Winchester obviously burns down during the Rout of Winchester. A lot of Winchester and its wooden buildings all get burnt down. So if you're in the Midlands and a little bit of the southwest, you're going to suffer. But after the Battle of the Standard, the north of England is relatively untouched. So the Anarchy is a bit of a misleading title, because people weren't like driven out of towns and cities or anything like that. Just they were sacked, because the majority of the warfare was sieges. So Wallingford Castle, the most powerful castle in and around the Midlands, was really a focal point, because that siege lasted for years. Sadly, there's not a lot left of Wallingford Castle. It was one of the great medieval castles of England, but a lot of it doesn't exist anymore, just a fraction of its walls and its outline. But back to what I think of King Stephen, like I said, I base it on how well they looked after the people, and I honestly do feel that King Stephen failed in that regard. I feel he had the aspirations to be a good medieval king, because towards the end of his reign, he was very active, he was trying to restore royal authority, bring down all the counter castles that were built, because, like I said, during the Anarchy, a lot of it was siege warfare, so there were a lot of counter castles being built at the time. And of course, if you want to build a castle, you need the king's authority. But obviously, because royal authority was weakened during the course of the Anarchy, especially when obviously Stephen was imprisoned, because if you didn't know this, one of the few pitched battles, the Battle of Lincoln, Stephen is actually captured in that battle. He's later ransomed thanks to his wife, also called Matilda, Queen Matilda. You see, I mentioned about there being a lot of Matildas. Well, there's Empress Matilda, and Stephen's wife was also called Matilda. So to make it easier, I always say Empress Matilda and Queen Matilda. So two girl bosses, and it's a very interesting period where during the Rout of Winchester, obviously Stephen's still imprisoned by Empress Matilda and her forces, but then Queen Matilda and her forces managed to capture Robert, Earl of Gloucester, Empress Matilda's half-brother, one of the many bastards of King Henry. So it's a case of they both ransom their prospective leaders back to each other. So Robert of Gloucester, the leader of Empress Matilda's military force, obviously King Stephen, the leader of his own faction. I understand I'm rambling on a bit about the Anarchy itself, but it's important to understand all of this when looking at King Stephen's reign, because like I said, the Anarchy is just the pinnacle of King Stephen's reign, because it pretty much lasted for the majority of his reign. But honestly, I think Stephen would have been a good king had the Anarchy not started, because from all accounts I've read, he was seen as kind and compassionate, and just in his positions. However, he could be rash, and that would affect him politically. For example, the way he imprisoned some of the bishops, as well as threatened to harm them had they not assigned Eustace or named Eustace as his heir, which was one of the crux of the later issues King Stephen had. Because it's interesting, with Stephen, we sort of see a deterioration with medieval kingship in England and the relationship with the clergy. Obviously, with Henry II, Stephen's successor, there's the big thing of Thomas Becket and his murder, inadvertently creating what would have been, had the Reformation probably not happened, the patron saint of England. I could definitely see Thomas Becket being a patron saint of England before or after St. George. So there's quite a few parallels with Stephen's reign and the later reigns of the Angevin kings in terms of their relationship with the church. However, Stephen was quite lucky that his brother was the Bishop of Winchester. So the way Stephen managed to secure the throne was he did very cleverly, I believe, in this. He got the loyalty of the Londoners, because this is where London and Winchester start to swap, where London becomes more paramount and more important, and Winchester sort of goes to the sideline, especially after the rout of Winchester, where most of Winchester is literally burnt down. So after securing the loyalty of the Londoners by promising not to tax them, which is obviously a very easy way to get people on your side, don't tax them, so libertarians would love King Stephen. But he also managed to secure the royal treasury, which was at Winchester, which is also what his predecessor, Henry I, did after his brother had died accidentally in the New Forest, was secure the treasury, because obviously you'll need money to enforce your claim, especially if you need to hire mercenaries. The third thing was he managed to find a man who basically said that Henry on his deathbed recanted and wanted Stephen to be king. And obviously remember, Henry and Stephen were very close. Stephen was brought up in Henry's court. So there's every chance that that may have been true. We don't know. We have to take the word of someone, because they managed to convince the Archbishop of Canterbury, the person who anoints and crowns the king, to basically side with Stephen, as opposed to Empress Matilda. Because remember, they had sworn, Stephen included, repeated oaths during the course of Henry's reign to support Empress Matilda. So by his actions of securing the throne, Stephen showed he was competent and could obviously win the nobles to his side, which was really the most important thing to do. Although at this point during the Anarchy, a lot of nobles simply swapped sides to suit their own interests, like Ranulph de Gernon, who was married to Robert of Gloucester's daughter. So there's a lot of back and forth, and each noble had different opinions of each ruler, and some used it to their advantage. One minute they would be on Stephen's side, then they would be on Empress Matilda's side, back and forth, back and forth. So royal authority really does get weakened during the course of the Anarchy. But I think if the Anarchy didn't happen, I think Stephen would have been a competent king. But again, the problem is his historical reputation is tarnished because of the Anarchy, and the fact that his predecessor, Henry I, and his successor, Henry II, their reigns are more remembered fondly, especially Henry II, who I'm a big fan of, because in my opinion, Henry II is the quintessential medieval king. If you were a medieval ruler, Henry II is the one to study. So that's what I think of King Stephen. Now, as for the public perception of King Stephen, similar to the other three we covered, I don't think there's much. In terms of his actual physical legacy, there's really not a lot. Obviously, the place he's buried, Faversham Abbey, is pretty much completely gone. Nothing remains of it, of its original medieval works. The site now is a private school. So there's no new cathedrals, there's no castles, really, that started during his reign, because obviously there wasn't much time or resources or revenue to build, as obviously there was a civil war going on, and you kind of need all your money to go towards mercenaries or siege engineers, that sort of thing for wartime. I imagine with the popularity of House of the Dragon, more people are aware of the source material if they go and look for it. So I noticed when I made my Anarchy series, most of the comments, none of them mentioned House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon gets made, the Anarchy, the long video of it, gets pushed more to more people because it's in the public sphere, and then I get more comments about, oh, I watched this because of House of the Dragon. Oh, this is how inspired House of the Dragon. So I get that sort of boost from the algorithm. so I can boast that everyone was doing the Anarchy. Oh, after I did it, because I was just so cool and edgy. I'm such a hipster. I kid. If I went back, I would probably do the Anarchy all over again because when I made that series, I obviously made it before I could draw maps, which became a staple of the channel since I've been drawing them. So, yeah. And I would probably use a hell of a lot more stock footage because obviously I've got better video recording equipment now. So I would have gone back to Wallingford and Winchester. I've been to Winchester quite a few times. It's actually a really nice city. So yeah, I think the public perception of Stephen is he's probably going to come more into the limelight because of the House of the Dragon, or has been. Like I said, more people might be aware of him. But it's similar to some of the earlier kings because we don't have any physical remains of him. And I highly doubt we'll ever find them because, like I said, Faversham Abbey was just completely demolished. And allegedly, Stephen's remains and his wife and his son Eustace were all thrown in the river. Yet they also said that about Richard III's remains, that they were thrown in the river after the Reformation or during the Reformation. And of course, we know that's not true because we found Richard about, how long ago was it? Oh yeah, 2012. So never say never, but I really don't think they'll ever find King Stephen. I know they've recently been obsessed with finding Henry I because we know he's buried at Reading Abbey, but I really don't think we'll ever find King Stephen, his wife, or his son Eustace, which is a great shame. To go alongside the public perception of King Stephen, he may be more familiar to gamers and fictional historical fans, as King Stephen does appear in quite a few fictional historical books and a video game, one I've been playing recently called The Pillars of the Earth, which is a historical fictional game set around the time period of the Anarchy where King Stephen is king, but it's set in a fictional location in England. And the premise of the story is to rebuild a fictional cathedral. And there's a storyline about the politics and counter castles and the power of the bishops, King Stephen, the Battle of Lincoln. So everything about the Anarchy is featured in this. And what you're seeing now, if you're watching this on YouTube, that's been playing as I've been talking during the video, is clips from that video game, because I thought it was very aesthetically beautiful. So I figured let's put it in for the video section of the podcast on YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I hope you're enjoying it. And like I said, it's a very pretty and aesthetically pleasing video game to look and play. You can pick up Pillars of the Earth on Steam. You can also play it on consoles. I, of course, have been playing it on Steam because I have a somewhat decent PC. Although you don't really need a decent PC to run this game. It's not a very demanding game, so don't worry about it. I'm just being facetious. And for people who have watched or listened to the last podcast, you'll also probably be aware that Stephen does appear in Crusader Kings 2 and 3. Although in Crusader Kings 2, you can actually select your start date, whereas in 3, you have selected set dates, for example 1066 and stuff like that. They may allow it in some of the DLCs to pick your own date in CK3, but I'm not paying for the DLCs because they're atrociously priced. So going back to Crusader Kings 2, obviously if you've played it, you'll be familiar with the trait system where each characters are assigned traits. And King Stephen has actually quite a few decent traits. There's the charitable trait, which we do have evidence for because when Henry II, or as he was known, Henry Fitz-Empress, came to England as a young man, basically to try and take the throne, he failed epically in his first attempt because he hadn't got enough money to pay his mercenaries. His mother and his uncle both refused to give him enough money to go back to Anjou. So Henry boldly asked his uncle, King Stephen, to give him some money to take a boat home. And King Stephen obliged. So that kind of works with that trait. I do, however, have a bit of a disagreement. They've not put the nervous trait in. So allegedly, before the Battle of Lincoln, King Stephen was too nervous to basically give a rallying speech to his men, so someone else did it for him. So there has been instances where he was nervous, so I'm surprised that trait isn't in there. But for the rest of the traits, there's like tough soldier, brave. So those are the kind of traits I would say, yeah, they match Stephen's personality. But Crusader Kings 2 is a great game for messing with history. So, for example, there's actually not really an event that goes over the Anarchy in both games, from what I've seen. There's no special event for it, sadly, which I think there is, given the length of the the Civil War. However, in one of my earlier playthroughs, when I played as King Henry, I managed to get Empress Matilda on the throne of Scotland. So I assassinated King David, arguably one of Scotland's best kings, and put Empress Matilda on the throne by making her his heir. Now, that also, I can't remember how it worked, but it also meant that I lost Normandy as well. So Normandy now belonged to Scotland, and Empress Matilda was Queen of Scotland, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. But in that playthrough, I actually managed to sire another heir called Arthur. So I managed to make a King Arthur after King Henry I, so I was quite happy with that. In another playthrough, where I played as King Henry again, I actually managed to get him to quite a really old age that he was given the title The Old, because obviously he was so old. He was like, I think he was about 75 before he died. So I really managed to avoid a lot of the problems, because by the time he died, Henry Plantagenet was old enough that he could nearly rule. And then I did another playthrough where I played as King Stephen, and instead of Empress Matilda trying to take the throne, Earl Robert tried to usurp me, obviously I was playing as King Stephen, to take the throne for himself, which I thought was quite interesting. So it was an interesting parallel, because there was every indication that Robert probably could have tried to take the throne, even if he was a legitimized bastard. So I believe they depict King Stephen quite well here. I should have said how they depicted King Stephen in the Pillars of the Earth video game. He is depicted, as all medieval kings are, enjoying a good hunt, as most medieval kings really, and I mean really, enjoyed hunting. It was like their pastime to escape from the whole world of being a king, basically. And in one of the first scenes where you meet King Stephen, that's kind of what he's obsessed about, is, I've done my royal duty, I want to go out and do some hunting. The Pillars of the Earth is quite a serious game. There's not really much nuance in the way of comedy, as there's normally whenever you play a medieval game set in England, there's normally a few Monty Python quotes. So I wasn't expecting for Stephen to come across a bridge and meet a mysterious man who asks 3 questions, especially as King Stephen, to quote one of my favourite films, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, "How do you know so much about swallows?" Well, you have to know these things as king, you know. We actually don't know how much King Stephen knew about swallows, African or European, so that's a mystery for the ages. I do enjoy how the Pillars of the Earth portray Stephen's brother, the Bishop of Winchester, Henry, as sort of this conniving weasel, because he sort of was. He was sort of like the guy in the background, really making things difficult for all of the characters involved in the Anarchy. He was sort of like that really annoying thorn in the side, was Henry, Bishop of Winchester. But the game does show off the issues King Stephen faced with bishops building their own counter castles or owning their own castles and fortifying them. So one of the big castles that one of the bishops of Lincoln had was Devizes Castle. Now, when I first made the Anarchy series, that castle was actually for sale for a cool, I think it was like £3 million. And I jokingly said, oh, if some YouTubers buy it, it's a new YouTuber house. Obviously, somebody has bought that house now, or should I say, bought the castle, and they have taken it off Google Maps. So if you go on Google Maps now and look for Devizes Castle, you can't take it. So it's in private hands now, which I think is wrong for such a historical castle. But that pretty much covers all the video games I could find that feature King Stephen. Obviously, if I've missed some, feel free to comment and let me know. As for television, the most famous show I can think of that is involving the Anarchy is the Cadfael Chronicles, which was a TV show about a monk around the time period of the Anarchy solving crimes, where I believe King Stephen appears in a few of the episodes. I haven't really watched them because it's a show from the 90s. I think it ran from 1990 to 94. So it's quite difficult to find clips from it. So sometimes some TV shows upload their clips to YouTube. For example, a very popular show that ran during the 90s was Sharp, which starred Sean Bean playing a soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. That has a dedicated YouTube channel now, but I don't think the Cadfael Chronicles does. So, but that's the only TV show that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't know if there's any drama adaptations of the Anarchy. I thought there was one, but it turned out it was War of the Roses, which is more popular in terms of the Civil War trope for English history, War of the Roses. Although I still think the Anarchy sounds better, but that's just my opinion. So moving on to sources of information for the Anarchy, there is quite a lot. The most famous chronicle you're going to come across is titled The Deeds of King Stephen, written by an anonymous monk. That obviously details the deeds of King Stephen, obviously, and what happened during the Anarchy. So it's a bit of a weird source because it starts off pro-Stephen, and then it sort of changes a little bit towards a bit more pro-Henry side. But then you've also got chronicles written by John of Worcester, who I've mentioned before. He detailed the sack of Worcester, which you can easily find online. There's a readable guide online, which I'll link in the description of the video. There's also accounts from very famous historians like William of Malmesbury, Orderic Vitalis, and of course the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles ends with King Stephen's reign, which I always thought was a bit poetic because it's titled the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. It's a compilation of all different chronicles from like the Peterborough Chronicle, the Worcester Chronicle, the Winchester Chronicle, all compiled into one. But it ends at King Stephen's reign, which I always thought was poetic because obviously King Stephen is considered the last Norman king of England. And for the sake of it, I will just read one of the last bits which involves King Stephen dying. So, 1154, in this year the King Stephen died, and was buried where his wife and son were buried at Faversham, the minster that they had made. When the king died, the earl was beyond the sea, that's Henry, and no man dared do other than good, because of great awe of him. Then, when he came to England, he was received with great honour, and was blessed as king in London on the Sunday midwinter day, and there held a great court. The good thing about this time period is it's actually incredibly easy to research because most of the resources needed to research this time period are all online. You can read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles online, you can read William of Malmesbury's accounts online, you can read John of Worcester's, Orderic Vitalis, etc., etc. So there's not really any real reason for people not to really explore this part of English history because I honestly think the Anarchy is a really underappreciated bit of English history. Right, well, we've gone over pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, so I suppose I'll now look at the Anarchy and the House of the Dragon and try and compare the historical characters to their fictional counterparts in the show. It's not going to be hard on some of the main characters. So obviously Empress Matilda is Rhaenyra, Henry I is her father, and King Stephen is Aegon II. Robert of Gloucester would most likely be Daemon Targaryen, as obviously in the show Daemon acts as the military commander in the show, and Robert obviously was the main leader and commander of Empress Matilda's forces, and Robert was so important he was traded for King Stephen after he was captured during the Rout of Winchester. So now it gets a bit tricky because you've got Adeliza of Louvain, Henry I's second wife. She fits the bill as Rhaenyra's Targaryen, the queen who never was, based on the character's actions in the TV show. I would fit the bill of her being Adeliza. Alicent Hightower is Queen Matilda, King Stephen's wife. That one's quite easy. Corlys, the sea snake, he would be King David because he supports Empress Matilda pretty much throughout the Anarchy. After he gets basically everything he wanted from King Stephen, lands in the north of England. The twins that are the King's Guard in the show, I believe they're based off the real-life twins that supported King Stephen, the Beaumont twins. So they were Anglo-Norman lords who supported King Stephen. One of them eventually swapped sides, I believe, and joined with Henry II. Then the other one fell out of favour and became a penniless noble. I believe that's what happened to him. I should have clarified Henry I is Viserys Targaryen, just to quickly go over that again. And Viserys' first wife is most likely based off of Matilda of Scotland, Empress Matilda's mother. Aemon Targaryen, I would say, is Eustace, King Stephen's son, who King Stephen tries to crown as his successor and threatens the bishops to do it. They refuse, he tries to imprison them. It's a nasty affair. Aemon Targaryen is Eustace. Helena Targaryen, that one's tough. I actually cannot think of a historical character who fits her bill, so I'm going to probably pass her over. Otto Hightower is quite an easy one, I think. His historical counterpart would be Henry, the Bishop of Winchester, King Stephen's brother, because Henry was very politically savvy and smart, which fits Otto's personality. Kristen Cole's historical counterpart, I would assign that to be William of Ypres, the right-hand man of King Stephen who led his armies during the rout of Winchester, where they captured Robert of Gloucester. Lenore Valerian, I would say that would probably be Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was married to Empress Matilda, who died relatively young. Because I'm doing this off the top of my head, I can't really think of any more characters from House of the Dragon. So if there are any characters I've missed, anyone comments in the comment section, I will try and answer them there. But I can't think of any more characters with their historical counterparts, so yeah. So that will conclude this episode of the Rambling Kings podcast. I hope you've all enjoyed listening or watching if you're watching this on YouTube. Generic YouTuber things, subscribe, like the video, share, comment, blah, 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 blah. The next king I'm going to probably cover is either going to be King Edgar, or I might try and do a spooky king for Halloween. I'll let you guys know. But thank you all for watching / listening, and I will speak to you guys next time. Cheers.